you argue that time is not on the Russian side anymore. So let's start there. So, what do you think has changed that it makes you say that?
So, so putting the camera back and going back to the early weeks of the war, I think it's become clear since March of 2022, when Russia failed to achieve its initial primary objectives of seizing Kiev and had to withdraw. It's been clear from that point on that the war would be decided as much as anything, not only by the fortunes and inherent capacities of the two combatants, Ukraine and Russia, but by the willingness and ability of other states, belligerents in the broader sense, not combatants, but belligerents contributing to the war effort. The war would depend on their willingness and ability to provide essential forms of support for the conduct of the war. And initially that meant Europe and North America. So the question then was how far and fast and how significantly the West would come to support Ukraine. And more recently, it has meant on the Russian side, China and North Korea in particular. Iran to a degree as well, but it's really China and North Korea that matter in terms of material sustenance and support for Russia's war effort. Now, if we therefore frame the dynamics of the war in terms of the willingness and ability of other countries to contribute to the war effort, I think that puts into clarifying perspective some important developments which have taken place in the past few months, almost all of which are harmful to Russia's long-term prospects. The first, probably most important, is the failure of the Kremlin to make effective use of the return of Donald Trump to the White House in January. This was a great opportunity, and Putin had spent much of 2023 waiting for the return of Trump. And as we know, in those first weeks and months of the second presidency, Trump was disposed to see the war more from Russian than from Ukrainian point of view. And the great fear in the West and in Kiev in particular was that American foreign policy would in due course abandon Ukraine and possibly even provoke a rupture in the transatlantic alliance. Now, that hasn't happened. There were moments where that seemed to come close, but that emphatically has not happened. And Trump, it appears, at least for now, we never know how things may change again, but for now, we're in a moment where Trump's theory of peace has changed from being one that required pressure to be put on Ukraine to compromise to a theory of peace through constraining and pressuring Russia. Now, Trump is doing things which really no one contemplated he might do. In particular, we can talk about this later in more detail if you're interested, imposing his first sanction against Russia in his second term. It was the sanctioning of Russia's two largest oil companies. So Putin has failed. It's a diplomacy that's not merely inflexible, but remarkably inept. He has failed to use the clear and obvious opportunity. Hasn't even really tried to give Trump an excuse to continue engaging constructively with Russia. Trump is palpably now frustrated and unhappy. That's the first thing. The second thing, barely less important, is that at the June summit in The Hague, NATO member states committed to a radical and rapid increase in their defense spending, 5% of GDP in 10 years. Now, just take Europe alone. Europe's collective GDP is vastly greater than Russia's. in fact, the margin of superiority in the capacity to make stuff that Europe enjoys over Russia is greater than the margin of superiority that the whole of the transatlantic alliance enjoyed over the whole of the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War. It's a fundamentally important point. You know that that Europe is much richer, both quantitatively and qualitatively, than Russia, but we underestimate the extent of that superiority. It follows from that, then even a small increase in GDP devoted to defense would result in a vast superiority in material defense capability. Even if European member states of NATO got to 3% or 3.5%, that is something that Russia could not possibly match. Now, if you're looking at this from the Kremlin's point of view, if you take these commitments made at the NATO summit seriously, then what you see is a slow, onrushing tsunami of defense capability for Europe's own defense, but also for provision to Ukraine as well. Now, of course, there's more to be said about these comparisons, and defensive strength, military capability are more than a matter of adding up numbers. In particular, we all worry about the fact that Europe has no non-strategic nuclear weapons, and Russia has several thousands. So there are certain sort of important capability gaps, on the conventional side as well. But if we take as a good first approximation underlying military capability, raw GDP, plowshares that you can turn into swords, then the scale of Europe's inherent latent superiority is unchallengeable. The same is true of population, incidentally. And you might recall that famous book by Paul Kennedy, the celebrated classic, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. If you had to distill that panoramic analysis of 500 years of European great power relations into one sentence, that sentence would read something like, in great power wars of vital interests, the bigger economy always wins. So that's the second worrying thing as far as Russia is concerned. The third thing, look within Russia at the growing strains that this combination of major war and severe sanctions are imposing on the Russian economy. Now, there's much to say about this, and people are constantly scrutinizing Russia's political economy for signs either of weakness or resilience. And very briefly, I would say we are entering a period now where the future will clearly be worse than the present or the past, as far as Russia's economy goes. And there are growing strains and tensions and distortions. And these are producing quiet signs of anxiety among parts of Russia's elites. So take those three factors in the round: what's happened to American diplomacy, what has happened to European commitments, and what is happening to Russia's economy. There is nothing fundamentally good in this story as far as Russia is concerned. And I'll finish on this for the moment, that is why, as I see it, we are seeing important new developments in Russia's policies, in particular, an escalation in risky behavior, incursions of drones and also of fighters into European airspace on a scale we hadn't seen before, and also this rapid escalation of attacks on Ukraine's critical infrastructure, in particular its energy infrastructure. Those attacks are not new, of course, but the scale of them is. So there is this sense of a window of opportunity for Russia slowly beginning to close if things don't change. So Russia, therefore, needs to accelerate the ways it's implementing its theory of victory, which is to grind down Ukraine materially and militarily, and to outlast and divide and intimidate the West politically.
If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter, Station Zero. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis. a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I talk about why there seems to be more and more war and conflict all around the globe, why it's not just a feeling but actually a verifiable fact, and why the increase in war can be explained with a niche mathematical theory and the plot of Jurassic Park, and what it means for the future of geopolitics. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description.